My security camera was torn from its mount, wires dangling, lens shattered. I knew exactly who might have done it. Karen, the self-appointed HOA dictator who was always just trying to keep the neighborhood nice. Something told me she'd finally overstepped her boundaries. If you're watching this, comment below where you're tuning in from, because trust me, when Karen strikes, everything turns upside down, and this time, she messed with the wrong person. I'd barely gotten my pulse under control when I realized there was no accidental explanation for the camera's twisted state. In fact, the wires looked meticulously clipped, and the outer casing had been pried off. It reminded me of a raccoon rummaging through trash, except this vandal had a plan. I took a breath, snapped a few photos, and tried to slow my heartbeat, which was hammering away like a war drum in my chest. Karen's face drifted through my mind. She was a short, middle-aged woman, but her personality more than compensated for her petite stature. Her trademark floral moo-moos fluttered dramatically whenever she stormed across someone's lawn to chastise them about improper hedge trimming or an unapproved mailbox design. If there was any offense that violated the Homeowners Association guidelines, even slightly, Karen would pounce like a cat that spotted a mouse. I'd only lived in this neighborhood for a year, but I'd heard the rumors long before I settled in. According to many, Karen had the entire HOA board under her thumb. She sweet-talked them when she needed to, then used her iron-fisted interpretations of the rules to terrorize unsuspecting residents. If you parked an RV in your driveway for even one night, you'd receive a stern letter on official HOA stationery, adorned with Karen's scribbled signature at the bottom. If your grass got too tall, she'd snap photos, email them to the board, and you'd be hit with a fine a few days later. And if you dared question the necessity of her decorum standards, she'd mount a personal campaign of intimidation that left you feeling unwelcome in your own home. I'd avoided her wrath initially, thinking my neatly kept lawn and simple aesthetic wouldn't draw her attention. But that all changed the day she saw the corner of my security camera peeking from beneath the porch awning. She marched over the next morning, practically pushing her face against my doorbell camera, still intact at that time, and demanded to know if my surveillance contraption was approved by the HOA. I explained politely that it pointed only at my own property for safety reasons. I had no interest in filming the rest of the neighborhood. But her expression hardened, and she made a big show of writing something down in a little notebook she carried everywhere. Later, I received a letter from the HOA about potential privacy concerns. That was the first sign of trouble. Even though the neighborhood guidelines allowed security cameras as long as they focused on one's own property, Karen insisted I was spying on my neighbors. Her vendetta kicked off with a few passive-aggressive notes taped to my front door, then escalated into official complaints. None held water, but they were stressful to deal with. Now, standing there with the destroyed remnants of my camera in hand, I suspected this was Karen's next step. Destroying my property was a new low even for her. A part of me wanted to sprint across the street and confront her. But I'd heard enough stories about Karen's cunning. She'd probably spin it as if I were harassing her, and if I ended up losing my temper in front of the HOA board, she'd have just the ammunition she needed. So I took a measured approach. I documented everything: the wire cuts, the shattered lens, the footprints in the soil near the camera mount. I even bagged a few shards of plastic in case the police needed them. Although the local station might dismiss it as petty vandalism, I figured evidence couldn't hurt. As I mulled over my next move, my phone buzzed. It was Lisa, my next-door neighbor and the one person in this cul-de-sac who'd been a true friend from day one. She was about my age, with a sarcastic sense of humor that kept me grounded. "Are you okay?" she asked immediately, her voice laced with concern. "I saw Karen skulking around your place last night when I took the trash out." Lisa had encountered Karen's wrath a few years back. Her front fence was apparently 6 inches taller than the HOA limit, and Karen, ever the enforcer, threatened fines that soared into 4 digits. Lisa ended up having to rebuild her fence at her own expense, all because Karen refused to let the board grant any exceptions. "Yeah, I'm fine," I told her, "but my camera's not. I'm pretty sure Karen destroyed it." Lisa let out a soft whistle. She doesn't know when to quit, does she? You should file a police report, even if it's just to have it on record. And talk to the HOA board. Maybe they'll see how far she's gone this time. I couldn't hold back a bitter chuckle. You think they'll believe me? She probably has them all wrapped around her finger. True, Lisa conceded. But the key is evidence. Karen's word against yours is a dead end, but if you've got photos, footage, anything that proves she did it, she can't weasel out so easily. That was easier said than done. The camera was destroyed and the main memory unit was missing, but I suddenly remembered that it also uploaded to a cloud-based service. I scrambled inside, opened my laptop and typed in my login credentials. Sure enough, the last recorded clip from the camera was corrupt, just static and a flicker of movement, but I noticed a timestamp. The final seconds of footage were captured at 10:42 p.m., and there was a silhouette approaching from the sidewalk. I played the clip over and over, but it was too grainy to identify the person's face. Still, the height and build matched Karen. The figure wore something that looked suspiciously like a floral pattern, though the image was so distorted I couldn't be certain. Another flash. Then the screen went black. That must have been the moment the camera was yanked off its mount. Lisa urged me to save the clip to multiple devices. Even if the footage is grainy, it's better than nothing, and you never know if some tech wizard can enhance it. With that done, I felt a spark of hope. Maybe I could prove this wasn't a random act of vandalism. Maybe for once, Karen would face real consequences. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that Karen might have crossed a line far bigger than just HOA rules. Destroying someone's security camera could be a serious offense if it involved tampering with network devices. I vaguely remembered reading about how certain laws protect electronic surveillance equipment, especially if it connects to services that operate across state lines. This could potentially be a federal matter. The realization made my heart pound faster. Partly in fear, but also in a sense of empowerment. Karen might have weaponized the HOA guidelines against me, but no HOA rule could override federal law. Despite the surge of adrenaline, a nagging doubt took hold. Karen was cunning. What if she argued that I was the one breaking the law, illegally filming her property? She'd done that sort of thing before, flipped the script so the victim ended up looking like the aggressor. I'd seen older neighbors pack up and leave after a relentless wave of HOA fines spearheaded by her, but I wasn't about to be the next casualty. Lisa and I formulated a plan. First, I'd reach out to the HOA board to inform them of the incident without openly accusing Karen. I'd frame it as a concern for the neighborhood's safety. If one person's camera could be vandalized, others might be at risk too. That might put the board in a bind, forcing them to take it seriously. Then, if that didn't work, I'd go to the police with my evidence. Lisa, ever the supportive friend, offered to back me up, sharing that she'd seen Karen lurking near my property. Even if she didn't witness the vandalism directly, her observation could still add context. We also decided it might be wise to keep any official mention of Karen's name to a minimum until we had more definitive proof. No sense in tipping her off that we were onto her. I wrote an email to the HOA board that evening. I kept it polite but urgent, attaching photos of the damage and the corrupted video file. I explained that I was concerned about someone destroying personal security devices in the neighborhood. Karen's name appeared only once, in a line mentioning that she had previously expressed disapproval of my camera. I didn't accuse her outright, but I wanted them to connect the dots. Then I hit send and waited. The response came quicker than I expected. A short email from an HOA representative indicated that they would look into it. Nothing more, no expression of alarm or sympathy, just a cursory acknowledgement. I couldn't shake the feeling that Karen had already spun her tale to them, painting me as some meddling neighbor who was paranoid and disliked by others. The next day I ventured out to the mailbox and found a fresh complaint slip from the HOA. It cited me for improper disposal of yard waste, referencing a single stray leaf that must have fluttered from my yard into the gutter. I stared at the slip in disbelief. It was dated the same day I'd reported my camera issue. Coincidence? Highly unlikely. I marched over to Lisa's place, clutching the complaint slip. She let out a sardonic laugh the moment she saw it. Karen's stepping up her game. She wants you buried in bureaucratic nonsense so you can't focus on the camera incident. That evening, I overheard raised voices coming from Karen's house. Through my window, I saw her in a heated phone call, gesturing wildly with that ever-present floral sleeve flapping around. I couldn't make out her words, but the tension radiated all the way across the street. My imagination ran wild, guessing she might be strong-arming the HOA board or rallying her allies to discredit me. 2 mornings later, the HOA posted a notice on the community bulletin board. In tidy letters, it reminded residents that all exterior security equipment must comply with privacy standards, and that excessive monitoring of neighbors was strictly prohibited. The subtext was obvious. They were suggesting my camera broke their rules, even though I'd installed it only to watch my own driveway. At that point, it felt like a game of chess. Each move I made, reporting the vandalism, sending proof, met with a counter-move from Karen, who manipulated the HOA's guidelines to cast doubt on my intentions. I was left thinking, how do I escalate this without triggering a full-on meltdown from Karen? Then again, maybe a meltdown was exactly what I needed, for her to slip up, to reveal her role in the vandalism. Lisa convinced me to attend the next HOA meeting. Go in there calmly, present your evidence, and ask what the board plans to do about potential vandalism. Don't bring up Karen directly at first, just see how they react. The thought of sitting across from Karen in a stuffy conference room made my stomach turn, but Lisa was right. I needed to confront this head-on, publicly, where Karen couldn't manipulate the conversation behind closed doors. So I prepared a quick slideshow of photos. The broken camera mount, the clipped wires, the footprints. I even threw in a screenshot of the glitchy final seconds from my camera feed. Nothing too dramatic, just the facts. When the meeting day arrived, I headed to the community center, my nerves frayed. The board members sat behind a long table, each with a stack of papers. Karen, naturally, was front and center, wearing her usual flowery attire and a saccharine smile. About a dozen residents were scattered around, some flipping through the monthly agenda, others murmuring quietly. The meeting started, innocuously enough, a discussion about upcoming landscaping projects, new speed limit signs, and proposals for a neighborhood barbecue. Then they announced an open forum. My heart thundered as I stood. I briefly introduced myself, thanked them for the chance to speak, and pulled up my slideshow on the small projector they had set up. Karen observed me with a tight-lipped grin, tapping her manicured fingernails on the table. I showed the first slide, the destroyed camera. The second slide, the close-up of the clipped wires. I explained I'd discovered it late at night, believed it to be sabotage, and wanted to alert the neighborhood. A couple of residents gasped, but the board members maintained impassive expressions. Karen cleared her throat. "Thank you for bringing this to our attention," she said, her voice oozing false sympathy. "It's certainly concerning if someone's breaking devices in our peaceful community. But we must also remember there are HOA rules about privacy. Wasn't your camera placed in such a way that it could record neighbors across the street?" I nearly choked on my frustration. "No, it was aimed at my own driveway," I replied, glancing at the other board members. "I have documentation proving the angle. I'm more than willing to show anyone who's curious." Karen waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, I'm sure you believe that, dear, but perception is reality for many residents who might feel uncomfortable seeing a camera pointed outwards." She turned to the board. "I suggest we conduct a thorough review of our surveillance device policy to prevent such misunderstandings." She was already twisting the narrative to make me seem like the aggressor. My cheeks heated. I wanted to shout that she was the likely culprit, but I remembered Lisa's advice. Keep it calm, keep it factual. "That's precisely why I reported it to the board," I said evenly. Because if my camera can be vandalized without consequence, then others might hesitate to install security measures, even if they comply fully with HOA rules. Karen's grin wavered for a split second. She glanced around, noticing a few neighbors nod in agreement. But she quickly recovered. "And we appreciate that concern. Of course, we'll look into it." She shifted in her seat. "Though it might be challenging to find the culprit without, actual footage of them." The jab was clear. My footage was corrupted and didn't show a clear face. But the meeting ended with the board stating they would further investigate. I left, feeling both disappointed and emboldened. Karen hadn't publicly pinned the blame on me, but she also hadn't shown any fear of repercussions. She acted as though she was confident she'd get away with it. On my way out, a resident approached me, a shy-looking older man named Mr. Browning. He whispered that he'd had run-ins with Karen before, regarding a basketball hoop his grandkids used when they visited. She'd deemed it unsightly and harassed him until he removed it. He offered to support me if I needed additional testimony about Karen's tendency to overreach. I thanked him, touched by his willingness to help. The next night, an unexpected twist arrived in my inbox. An email from an unknown sender containing a short video clip of Karen strolling up my driveway on the very night my camera was trashed. My heart pounded as I watched her in grainy black and white rummaging near the camera mount. The clip ended abruptly, but it was far clearer than the footage I had. The timestamp matched the last known activity from my broken device. I forwarded it immediately to Lisa. "Where on earth did this come from?" I asked, baffled. She had no idea. We speculated maybe it was from a neighbor's hidden camera or some angle that captured Karen. While the clip wasn't crystal clear, it was undeniably her floral print dress, her distinct short haircut, and her posture. This was the smoking gun I needed. However, a wave of caution washed over me. Could this be a setup by Karen to make me look foolish for presenting manipulated footage? Paranoia crept in, but as I watched the clip repeatedly, my gut told me it was authentic. Karen didn't seem the type to orchestrate a scheme that implicated herself so directly. Armed with this new piece of evidence, I decided it was time to file a police report. I wasn't sure if they would take it seriously, but vandalism with video proof might at least prompt them to question Karen, and if she lied or became defensive, that might further incriminate her. When I showed up at the police station, the desk officer raised an eyebrow at my story. "HOA drama, huh? We get a lot of those." Still, he took my statement, accepted the USB drive with the video, and promised someone would follow up. I left feeling equal parts relieved and anxious. What if this escalated things in the neighborhood? Would Karen retaliate even more intensely? Lisa reassured me that this was the right call. "Don't let her bully you into silence," she said firmly. We chatted about the possibility of Karen being found liable not just for property damage, but potentially for violating laws against tampering with surveillance devices. Lisa half-joked that the feds would swoop in if Karen had messed with a system connected to a cloud service. "Wouldn't that be ironic?" she said. "She tries to scare people with HOA threats and then ends up facing federal charges." But within a few days, the tension soared again. A rumor spread that Karen was telling the board I'd fabricated the video. She was apparently claiming I'd hired someone to dress like her, forging a ridiculous cameo to frame her for vandalism. As absurd as that sounded, a couple of neighbors actually believed it, because they'd seen how petty some HOA disputes could get. That rumor infuriated me, and I realized I needed more direct confirmation of the video's authenticity. I took the clip to a tech-savvy colleague from work, someone who could analyze its metadata. He confirmed that the video's timestamp and digital signature seemed legitimate, with no obvious signs of tampering. Though this was informal analysis, it gave me confidence to present it openly at the next HOA meeting. When that meeting arrived, Karen was her usual smug self, but the moment I stood to speak and mentioned the new video, her eyes narrowed. I played it on the projector, letting the loop run a few times. Gasps rippled through the small audience. Karen shook her head, forcing a laugh. "This is preposterous," she exclaimed. "Anyone could be wearing a floral dress." You think you can just wave a fuzzy video around and call me a criminal? I met her gaze head on. I'd be happy to have digital experts verify it. Perhaps the HOA can hire an independent party to confirm whether it's been doctored. Silence thickened in the room. One or two board members exchanged uncertain glances. It seemed they didn't want to go head-to-head with Karen, but they also couldn't ignore the evidence. Karen's face reddened slightly, but she kept her composure. "I have nothing to hide," she said with a sniff. "Do what you must." The session ended with a promise from the board to convene privately and discuss next steps. Outside, Mr. Browning offered me a small smile. "You're brave," he said. "I can't tell you how many of us have just given in to her demands. Maybe this time she won't be able to brush it off so easily." Yet I knew Karen well enough by now. She'd never concede quietly, and sure enough, within days I received a letter, an actual physical letter tucked under my doormat. It bore no return address, but the handwriting was unmistakably Karen's. She wrote a screed about how I was treading on dangerous ground, threatening me with defamation lawsuits and warning that I was woefully unprepared for the consequences of slander. I half expected a cartoonish skull and crossbones at the bottom. Instead of terrifying me, it fueled my determination. I marched next door to Lisa, letter in hand. She read it, rolled her eyes, and said, "If she thinks a letter full of threats is going to stop you, she's delusional." We decided the best course of action was to show it to the police, adding it to the file I'd already started. Harassment could be added to the potential charges if they deemed it credible. While the officer on duty took the letter seriously, he warned me that these things often devolve into a he said, she said situation. However, the new video evidence was a different matter. It pointed directly to Karen's involvement. "We'll conduct a few interviews," he assured me, "gather more information." At this point, the stress of the ordeal weighed on me. Sleep came in sporadic bursts. Every time I spotted Karen's silhouette in her front window, my pulse raced. I was torn between wanting her to face justice and fearing what she might do in retaliation. Then a ray of light appeared in the form of an HOA bulletin. A mandatory meeting had been scheduled to address urgent security issues in the neighborhood. The date was set for a week from then, and all residents were encouraged to attend. Lisa thought it might be the moment of truth. "They can't keep ignoring your evidence. Too many people are whispering about that video." She was right. Word spread quickly that Karen might finally be held accountable, or at least questioned publicly about the vandalism. Then, 2 days before the meeting, a bizarre development took place. Someone posted an edited clip on the neighborhood's online forum, showing me supposedly screaming at a delivery driver in my driveway, calling them horrible names. The clip was from my own security feed, which meant the footage had to have come from my camera or my cloud storage. But I'd never shouted at a delivery person like that. The voice in the clip did sound a bit like me, but the entire incident was alien to me. The background looked slightly off and the person's face was half hidden. Could Karen have staged a deep fake? Neighbors began to comment. Some expressed shock at my behavior. Others defended me, saying it could be fake. A few made jokes, calling the situation the war of the cameras. My phone buzzed incessantly with notifications. Lisa texted me with curses, furious that Karen had stooped to such a level. This time, though, I recognized Karen's attempt to muddy the waters. She wanted to discredit me, to make me look like a rage-filled neighbor who might have contrived the vandalism story for attention. I knew I had to disprove this fabricated footage fast. I rummaged through my saved files, searching for the real clip from the day in question. My actual footage showed me politely directing the driver to the correct address. There was no shouting at all. If anything, I was too apologetic. She'd used a different angle, maybe from one of her own hidden cameras splicing the audio from another incident. Who knows? It was a messy hack job, but to someone who didn't know me well, it might appear credible. The pettiness of it all made me laugh bitterly, but also reminded me Karen would stop at nothing to save her own skin. Determined to expose the lie, I prepared a side-by-side comparison of the real footage and her edited version. By the morning of the HOA meeting, I was armed with more evidence against her than ever before. Now it wasn't just sabotage, it was slander, or at least a malicious attempt at defamation. I arrived at the community center early, carrying a laptop and flash drive loaded with everything I'd collected. Residents filtered in slowly, many looking weary of the ongoing drama. Karen was already seated at the board's table, flanked by two members who rarely spoke in my favor. Her posture was stiff, her lips drawn in a thin line. She barely glanced at me. When the meeting commenced, the board president read off the top agenda item: discussion of community security and unresolved issues regarding recent acts of vandalism. That was my cue. I stood, introduced myself yet again, and methodically showed the key footage: the original clip of Karen at my driveway, the newly acquired clip from the anonymous source, and the cloud logs confirming the time and date. I also displayed her threatening letter. Then I played her edited video of me supposedly screaming at the delivery person. Laughter and gasps erupted in the room at the clumsy nature of the editing. Finally, I showed my authentic video from that same day, which revealed a polite interaction with the driver. Murmurs swept through the crowd. Karen's expression slipped from condescension to outright panic. She glanced around, possibly searching for an ally. The board members were stone-faced. Mr. Browning raised his hand and stated that he'd had a similar experience with Karen, editing or twisting some photos to make him look like a repeat violator. Another neighbor chimed in about suspicious late-night rummaging in her trash cans. A figure in floral attire caught on a separate camera. It was a tidal wave of complaints, old wounds, and new revelations. Karen tried to speak, but the board president silenced her with a raised hand. The unstoppable force of her own community's resentment bore down on her. All the while, I stood there feeling a mixture of vindication and shock. I'd expected pushback, maybe anger, but not this avalanche of confessions from neighbors who'd been bullied in silence. When the board members finally let Karen speak, she seemed dazed. Her voice trembled as she accused me of orchestrating a smear campaign, forging the video, and turning everyone against her. But the more she talked, the deeper she sank. She had no credible explanation for how she acquired my camera footage, nor could she justify the suspicious video of her at my driveway that same night. By the end of the meeting, the board announced that, pending a final review, Karen's position would be suspended, effective immediately. They acknowledged the police report I'd filed and stated they would cooperate fully if any legal investigation took place. The room erupted in hushed conversation as neighbors realized that Karen, a fixture of the HOA, a figure both feared and obeyed, was finally facing consequences. I met Lisa's eyes across the room, and she grinned widely, giving me a thumbs up. Mr. Browning patted my shoulder, muttering, "About time." A swirl of relief, disbelief, and lingering dread filled me. Karen was cornered, but I knew she wasn't the type to concede gracefully. Sure enough, as people began to file out, she stood up sharply and pointed a trembling finger at me. "You're not going to win," she hissed. "You think you can humiliate me like this? I'll see you in court." Then she spun on her heels, storming out before anyone else could respond. I sighed, realizing that this fight might not be over just because the HOA stripped her title. Still, this was a major victory. For once, she couldn't hide behind the board's authority. If she pushed her threats further, it would become a matter for the legal system, where her manipulations would carry less weight. If I'd learned anything, it was that Karen thrived in an environment of fear and silence. Now the community was no longer afraid, and I was far from silent. The morning after the HOA meeting, I checked my email, half expecting an onslaught of new accusations or legal threats from Karen. Instead, I found a short, politely worded message from a detective at the local police department. He requested a meeting to clarify some details about the vandalism incident and the associated evidence. My adrenaline spiked as I realized the police were taking this seriously. When I arrived at the station, the detective greeted me with a firm handshake and guided me to a small interview room, walls adorned with motivational posters. He asked me to recount the whole story from the beginning. I laid out each piece of evidence, including the newly acquired footage of Karen. He nodded thoughtfully, occasionally jotting notes. "We've also spoken to Ms. Karen," he remarked. "Her version differs significantly from yours." Apparently, Karen claimed I was the one harassing her, installing a camera to spy on her family, forging recordings to damage her reputation, and so forth. I mentioned the fiasco with her doctored clip of me yelling at a delivery driver. The detective nodded, explaining that digital forensics could sometimes detect whether videos had been manipulated. I felt a flicker of hope. This wasn't going to hinge on he said, she said alone. By the way, he added, our cybercrimes division is looking into how your original footage was accessed. If we find evidence that your system was hacked or tampered with, that opens a different can of worms entirely. I swallowed hard. Karen messing with my camera was bad enough, but if she'd also illegally accessed my cloud storage to retrieve or alter footage, we might be dealing with federal charges related to unauthorized computer access. I left the station feeling like this was bigger than a mere HOA dispute. Karen's sabotage may have turned into a full-on criminal scenario. Back in the neighborhood, tension simmered. Some neighbors were openly supportive, thanking me for challenging Karen's tyranny. Others seemed cautious, perhaps waiting to see which way the wind would blow. Karen herself stayed out of sight, though I'd occasionally spot her peering through the curtains. The rumor mill churned with tales of how she might retaliate. Some said she had a cousin who was a lawyer. Others whispered that she'd once sued a neighbor for defamation over a petty argument. Lisa tried to keep my spirits up, joking that Karen might show up one day with a bullhorn, screaming HOA bylaws at me. But behind her jokes, I sensed concern. We both knew Karen wasn't the type to roll over quietly. She thrived on conflict, especially when she could control the narrative. Then late one evening, a faint tapping at my door startled me. I opened it cautiously to find Mr. Browning standing there fiddling with his cap. I didn't mean to disturb you, but I've got something you might want to see. He held up a small flash drive, explaining that he had a security camera capturing the view of the street from his porch. I checked the footage from the night your camera was busted. This might be important. Inside, we loaded the footage on my laptop, scanning through the timestamps. Sure enough, around the same time my camera was destroyed, there was a figure creeping along the sidewalk. The figure glanced around, then darted toward my driveway. Though the resolution wasn't perfect, the floral outline was unmistakable. The distance made it hard to see her face, but the clothing was too distinctive to be anyone else. Karen wore a matching outfit in the original video from the anonymous source. This was yet another angle placing her at the scene. My heart raced. This helps corroborate the other videos, I said, gratitude flooding my voice. Thank you, Mr. Browning. I can't believe you went to this trouble. He shrugged modestly. I can't stand bullies, he replied. Ever since she made me tear down that basketball hoop, I've been waiting for someone to stand up to her. Now we have a chance. The next day, I forwarded the new footage to the detective. He responded within hours requesting permission to add it to the growing case file. It dawned on me that Karen might actually face criminal charges, not just a slap on the wrist from the HOA. Yet I also felt a pang of guilt. I never wanted a neighbor to be arrested or publicly humiliated. All I wanted was to live peacefully without fear of sabotage. Meanwhile, the HOA board sent out an email blast confirming that Karen had been suspended from her position pending the outcome of the investigation. They distanced themselves from her actions, emphasizing the community's commitment to safety and respectful conduct. This was a colossal shift from the days when Karen practically ran the show. It felt like watching a toppled dictator's regime unravel. As the days passed, more revelations emerged. One neighbor discovered that Karen had been collecting data on residents, snapping clandestine photos of their yards, cars, and any perceived violation. She even kept a spreadsheet detailing her planned complaints. It was chilling to see how far she'd gone. Another neighbor, a young mom, recalled a time Karen insisted the family's inflatable pool was a hazard. She demanded it be removed, threatening a massive fine if they didn't comply. Apparently, Karen had also taken pictures of the children playing, claiming it was proof of the violation. The mom was furious but never reported it. Now she regretted staying silent. By the end of that week, the detective invited me to meet with a representative from the district attorney's office. My stomach dropped. This had escalated way beyond a simple neighbor feud. The conversation was straightforward. The DA's office was considering pressing charges for vandalism, trespassing, and possibly unauthorized computer access, felonies if proven. They wanted to gauge my willingness to testify, along with any other neighbors who'd been victimized. Despite my initial fear of public legal battles, I found myself eager to do whatever it took to resolve this. Karen's intimidation had paralyzed the neighborhood for too long. If testifying meant ensuring she couldn't keep threatening people, I was in. The DA representative asked if I'd be comfortable speaking about the entire ordeal. From the destruction of my camera to the fabricated video smear, I agreed. A few nights later, I was curled up on my couch, half watching TV, half lost in thought, when my phone buzzed with a text. It was from Lisa. "Karen's yard is swarming with cops." My heart jolted. I immediately peeked out my window. Sure enough, flashing blue and red lights danced across the street. 2 patrol cars were parked in front of Karen's house, and officers were at her door. She seemed to be arguing, jabbing a finger in the air, but after a tense exchange, she was escorted to the back of one of the vehicles. All sorts of emotions collided inside me: relief, shock, sadness, and a strange sense of finality. I stepped onto my porch, watching the scene unfold. A few neighbors stood on their lawns, some openly gawking, others wearing uneasy expressions. One older woman clasped her hands to her chest, whispering, "I never thought I'd see the day." Karen maintained her air of indignation even as she was driven away. She didn't look at me, but I could imagine the vitriol simmering in her mind. Part of me felt almost sorry for her, someone so obsessed with enforcing petty rules that she'd destroyed her own reputation. But mostly I felt a wave of relief. Finally, there was a chance this nightmare would end. In the immediate days after Karen's arrest, the neighborhood was abuzz. Gossip and rumors flew. Some said she'd been released on bail within hours. Others speculated she might try to flee. The official statement from the police was that she faced charges for property damage and potential cybercrimes, pending an investigation. The DA's office was tight-lipped, but neighbors hinted that Karen had openly boasted about her connections, implying she might skate free. I tried to resume a normal life, go to work, water my plants, maybe even enjoy a quiet evening without bracing for a new wave of harassment. Lisa checked in frequently, reminding me we'd come a long way. "You did everything right," she said. "Got the evidence, involved the authorities, didn't stoop to her level." Still, a layer of anxiety clung to me. What if Karen found a way to twist the charges? What if she retaliated somehow? My mailman confessed Karen had approached him a few weeks back, fishing for dirt on me, but he'd refused to share anything. That was the kind of underhanded tactic she was known for. Even in custody or out on bail, I doubted she'd stay idle. A formal hearing date was set, about a month away. The prosecutor handling the case indicated that if I was called to testify, I should bring any and all original files and footage, along with a detailed timeline of events. I spent hours compiling everything, double-checking it, replaying in my mind the day I first found my ruined camera. Meanwhile, the HOA board underwent a mini reformation. They issued a neighborhood-wide apology acknowledging that certain board members had misused their authority to target residents. Though they never mentioned Karen by name, everyone knew who they meant. They set up a new committee focusing on community relations, hoping to rebuild trust and encourage open dialogue. A few residents were skeptical, but I chose to see it as a positive step forward. Mr. Browning and I became unlikely allies in all this. He'd always been polite but distant, a solitary figure. Now we chatted over our fences, sharing tidbits of new developments, swapping stories about times Karen had tried to strong-arm us. The experience of standing up to her brought the neighborhood closer in an odd way. Even neighbors who barely knew each other were now connecting, sharing relief that they weren't alone in feeling oppressed. One day, Lisa and I sat on my porch steps, sipping iced tea in the late afternoon sun. The tension that once hovered over my yard felt noticeably lighter. "I can't believe how far this has come," I said, staring at the spot where my camera used to hang. I'd replaced it, but the new device was tucked discreetly under the eaves, less conspicuous. All because I wanted a security camera on my own property. Lisa laughed wryly. "Karen messed with the wrong person, or the right person, depending on how you look at it. Someone had to stop her." She clinked her glass against mine. "Cheers to a drama-free future. Well, at least less drama." It felt surreal to finally have a sense of normalcy, yet part of me was still on edge. Karen might be down, but was she out for good? The hearing was weeks away, and if she managed to maneuver her way through it, we could be back at square one. But every time worry crept in, I reminded myself that I wasn't alone. The entire neighborhood had collectively thrown off Karen's chokehold, and with the police involved, the matter was no longer just an internal HOA fiasco. Sure enough, the day arrived when I received an official summons to testify. My stomach flipped as I read the letter, even though I expected it. Lisa offered to drive me to the courthouse for moral support. When the hearing date came, we found ourselves in a stark, wood-paneled room that felt like the set of a TV drama, except this was real. My hands trembled slightly as I clutched my folder of evidence. Karen sat at the defendant's table, looking unusually subdued in a plain blazer, no floral prints in sight. Her lawyer, a wiry man with a perpetual scowl, whispered to her now and then. When I took the stand, I felt her glare searing into me. I recounted everything: the camera's destruction, the grainy footage, her doctored videos, the threatening letter, Mr. Browning's clip. I could see the judge listening intently, occasionally nodding or scribbling notes. Then Karen's lawyer tried to dismantle my testimony, questioning the authenticity of the videos, suggesting it might be a neighborhood conspiracy. But the prosecutor calmly produced expert statements verifying the video files. Another highlight was when a digital forensics specialist took the stand, explaining how they traced certain editing artifacts to Karen's computer. The hush in the courtroom was electric as they pointed out the digital breadcrumbs. Lisa's testimony further sealed the deal. She described seeing Karen near my driveway the night of the vandalism, albeit at a distance, and confirmed Karen's open hostility toward my camera. By the time Mr. Browning shared his piece about the vantage point footage, Karen's lawyer was running out of ways to refute the mounting evidence. Midway through the hearing, Karen herself was asked to speak. She rambled about how she was a pillar of the community, just trying to enforce proper standards, how I'd been targeting her reputation, and how the footage was a product of editing illusions. But her explanations were evasive and contradictory. The prosecutor hammered her with pointed questions. Why was she at my driveway so late? Why did the camera feed show distinct signs of tampering linked to her devices? Karen's answers often drifted into tangents about how disrespectful the younger residents were, or how she had only wanted to keep everyone safe. It was painfully obvious she had no solid defense. When the hearing concluded, the judge stated that there was sufficient evidence to move forward with multiple charges against Karen, including destruction of property and unauthorized access to a computer system. She wouldn't be locked up immediately, but the case would head to trial unless a plea bargain was reached. The tension in the room was palpable as Karen's face went pale. Her lawyer tried to maintain composure, but it was clear they'd been blindsided by the strength of the evidence. Exiting the courthouse, Lisa and I exchanged a mixture of triumphant and exhausted smiles. A few neighbors had come to observe, some giving me pats on the back, others hugging me. Karen slipped out a side door with her lawyer, avoiding eye contact. It struck me that the entire neighborhood was here because they'd collectively suffered under her intimidation. It wasn't just my fight anymore. It was ours. In the following weeks, Karen's name became synonymous with cautionary tales about how far one person could push an HOA's authority. The board sent a final memo to all residents, clarifying a new oversight process to prevent future abuses of power. They also invited volunteers to form a neighborly conflict resolution committee, aiming to foster direct dialogue before issues escalated. It was an earnest attempt to rebuild the sense of community that Karen had eroded. Karen herself kept a low profile. Whether out on bail or awaiting trial, she rarely left her house. Occasionally, a car would pick her up, presumably for meetings with her lawyer. A few neighbors whispered that she might take a plea deal, anything to avoid a public trial that would further tarnish her image. The rumor was that she was terrified of a federal conviction and the potential jail time or steep fines that came with it. I felt a range of emotions: relief that the immediate danger was gone, pride in my stand, and even a twinge of sadness for how one neighbor's obsessive need for control had led her to destroy her own standing in the community. Still, I didn't regret exposing her actions. She'd left me with no choice. One crisp morning, I stepped onto my porch, gazing at the new, well-secured camera. A gentle breeze stirred the wind chimes, which Lisa had gifted me to ward off negative energy. In the distance, I noticed Mr. Browning rummaging in his front garden, a slight smile on his face, as if he could finally breathe easily. Other neighbors walked their dogs or jogged around the block, no longer casting fearful glances at Karen's house. The entire atmosphere felt lighter, more open. A few days later, an envelope arrived in my mailbox. Inside was a letter from Karen. My heart fluttered as I read her neat handwriting. She didn't outright apologize. Her pride, I suspected, wouldn't allow it, but she acknowledged in guarded words that she had overstepped boundaries and was reevaluating her approach to community standards. She ended by saying she would be stepping down from the HOA entirely and hoped we could all find peace moving forward. I couldn't decide if the letter was genuine remorse or a strategic move orchestrated by her lawyer. Either way, it signaled the end of an era. I tucked it away, unsure if I'd ever respond. Perhaps letting things rest was the best path. In the months that followed, the DA's office reached out to inform me Karen had agreed to a plea deal for the vandalism and unauthorized access charges. She would face fines, probation, and be required to undergo some form of community service. While some neighbors wished for a harsher penalty, I found it fitting that she'd have to serve the very community she once dominated. Maybe that would force her to see what it means to truly help neighbors rather than terrorize them. Life in the neighborhood began to feel normal, truly normal for the first time since I moved in. We held a modest block party where new friendships blossomed. Kids rode their bikes freely without parents worrying about stepping on Karen's toes. An air of cautious optimism replaced the old dread. Even the board's new leadership seemed eager to learn from past mistakes. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, I caught myself smiling for no particular reason as I mowed my lawn. The tension that had once haunted every corner of my property was gone. My camera had been replaced by a newer model, but it was now more a precaution than a necessity born of fear. I'd grown from the ordeal, finding a reserve of resilience I hadn't known I possessed. And the neighborhood had grown too, uniting in the face of adversity. Lisa teased me occasionally. "Guess you're the unofficial hero around here now, the one who tamed the HOA Karen." I'd laugh and roll my eyes, insisting I was just a concerned homeowner who refused to be bullied. But as more neighbors came up to thank me or share their relief that Karen's reign was over, I started to accept that maybe I did something that mattered. I'd stood up not just for myself, but for everyone who'd been cowed by her tactics. Walking past Karen's house one evening, I glimpsed her silhouette behind the curtain. For a moment, our eyes almost met. She retreated quickly, her posture stooped, as if weighed down by her own actions. I felt no triumph, only a wistful sense of what could have been if she'd chosen to be a helpful leader instead of a tyrant. But we each carve our path, and hers led to legal ramifications and isolation. In the end, the greatest lesson I took away was the importance of speaking up, even when the odds seemed stacked against you. Karen had thrived on a culture of silence. The minute enough of us stepped forward, her power dissolved. It wasn't easy. Fear and self-doubt nearly shut me down on many occasions. But with the help of friends, neighbors, and ultimately the law, the truth prevailed. Looking around my yard, I caught sight of the new sign the HOA had approved, one simply stating "Community Watch," encouraging residents to look out for one another in positive ways. I marveled at the irony. In the end, we were building a neighborly watch that actually respected everyone's privacy rather than invading it. Perhaps that was the final takeaway. Real community thrives on mutual respect, not intimidation. I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath of the early evening air. The rustle of leaves and the distant laughter of children playing replaced the tension that once gripped this street. And in that peace, I found gratitude. For the camera that started this all. For Lisa's unwavering support. For Mr. Browning's crucial footage. And even for the police and DA who made sure justice was served. Most of all, I was grateful that we'd broken the spell of fear, reminding everyone that the power of community can triumph over a single individual's destructive reign. With that thought, I turned to head inside, leaving behind the final traces of a bitter conflict. The camera on my porch blinked steadily, capturing nothing but a serene street. Karen's sabotaging days were over, and in their place a renewed sense of camaraderie took root. I hoped that, in her own way, Karen would find a path forward, just as we all had, because this neighborhood was worth fighting for, and now it finally belonged to everyone again.